Everybody for joining today. I know some people are still logging in, so welcome to everyone who's here. A few logistics to get us started. We are going to have all lines muted. We've got a lot of content to get through today, so we are going to hold questions until the end. And we do ask them that you post all those questions in the Automation Hour Trailblazer community so we can make sure we get to all of them if we happen to run out of time today. We are recording the session, and so we will post it to the Automation Hour YouTube channel once the session is done today. As always, we want to make sure that you can access some additional resources around automation. So please give us a follow in the Salesforce Automation Hour community on the Trailblazer community, and also the website Automation Hour. We also have a brand new Twitter handle, so you should follow us there too. As always, we are thrilled that you're with us today, but please come back and visit us again for a future session. We've got some great presenters coming up. We've got the rest of the year booked out, and all of those sessions are available for you to register on automationhour.com. And of course, we would not be able to bring this to you without the help of our amazing sponsors. So we want to give a shout out first to ActiveCampaign, who does a great job helping us get the word out for this, as well as Concrete.io. Who's been with us since the very beginning. So, and we that are thanking you are your co-hosts. I am Michelle, obviously, and also with us today is our co-host Rakesh Gupta. But with that, we are going to pass presenting privileges over to our amazing MVP guest, Monica Sandberg. So Monica, it's coming your way.
Right, and which screen am I showing? I
think
showing
we got the right one.
Screen. That is not the. That's not the right.
I think we've got your presenter view on as opposed to your.
Yeah, hold on. I need to. How do I change that? Hold on. I haven't had this happen before.
I think under show screen, there's a little drop-down menu that should give you the ability to pick your monitor.
I am looking for the show screen. Hold on a second. I'm just going to have to switch it may not be as good of a resolution. We're just going to switch this. How's that? Better?
Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent.
That'll work. Hello, everybody. Hold on just 1 second. That should work. All right. Thank you, Michelle and Rakesh. I am thrilled to be back here on Automation Hour. My name is Monica Sandberg, and I'm also known in the community as Not as Blank Monica. I'm an InsurTech innovator, architect, and admin, 5-time Salesforce MVP, 4-time Dreamforce speaker, and now 4 times Automation Hour guest. I'm just thrilled and humbled to be here. And as always, I'm going to say it again, that I don't have all the answers, but I do have lots and lots of questions. And I do think that that is what makes you a really good admin or a developer or an architect, is to have those questions, to ask those questions, and to be curious. And that is how we innovate on the platform. And today, those questions are around flow best practices. And I say part 1, because to be honest, there is just no way we can do demos and discussions on all of it. So we are definitely, this is going to scratch the surface, but there are some things that we are going to deep dive into. And we're going to aim for best practice with flows, and we're going to talk about why it matters. Reach out to me on Twitter, on YouTube, or LinkedIn. So, all right, I know you're thinking, oh God, here we go again, best practices. Not exactly sexy. And I know you're thinking, I already know you're thinking it's going to be boring. And maybe it is a little bit on that side. Maybe it is, but I can tell you from experience, if we don't get our automation right, it will make a difference and you will pay the price. And how does this happen is because all of us are under so much pressure at our jobs, and we have a business use case and we have to solve it. And we have an automation solution and a business use case and a solution, and a business use case and a solution. And that kind of insanity is why Salesforce finally We've been getting drips and drabs and little pieces of best practices. But here it is in black and white, came out June 16th, 2021. This is the inspiration for this session. And Salesforce on the admin site has given us the ultimate guide to flow best practices and standards. And there's some really good stuff here. Now, I want all of you, I am hoping that all of you check this out on your own and read this best practice list. But I will say that this is a starting point. That if you think you're just going to read this list and get on with your day and it's all going to sink in and you're going to know exactly what to do, that's why I did this session, because really you have to dig a little deeper. You have to experiment. You have to understand these concepts beyond the surface. So we want to go a little bit deeper, and that's what we're going to do today. And that is the point of the session. And I hope you see what I've done in my process, and that will inspire you to do your own process. And how I start this process whenever I'm learning anything new, and you saw this in my last session, I'm just going to point it out in case you didn't, that you need a developer org, in my opinion, better than a Trailblazer Trailhead org, and get into your developer org and play around with some of these concepts that we're going to talk about today. And so in this last session, I went into detail about how to set up that developer org. All right, here it is, that long scrolling list, number 1 on Salesforce list. Oh God, I know it. I can hear the boos. I know y'all are on mute, and I can hear the boos right through the webinar here. And I'm with you. Yuck. I mean, come on. None of us like this part of it. Maybe some. I don't know. But a lot of us, this is document your flows. Oh my God. But I have news for you. When you're talking about flow, if you were to run a debug, what does it say? It says Apex. Okay. So we are developers, and developers have all kinds of strict enforcement and all kinds of rules they have to adhere to when they're writing code. But unfortunately, or fortunately, when we're in flow and we're doing things, a lot of things we can kind of just do. And there won't be too many repercussions, but yes, there are. So one of the things you notice here is naming across the second thing down, ensure consistent naming across elements and variables. And what Salesforce has done is they've given us an example of this. And so they have included a link. The blue is a link to a wiki article. And here it is. Okay. So I have always had some type of naming convention. It has gotten better. Well, I won't say that. When I first started building flows, I did not. And that was many, many, many years ago. As time goes on, I have learned, and you've seen me do sessions and talk about naming. So I have a naming convention, and it is evolving. It has evolved as Salesforce Flow has evolved. I've had to make modifications, and I've learned things along the way. I would say for everyone to read this naming convention that they're pointing to, but what's important is not that you follow that one or that you follow mine, because I'm going to show you mine as well. That's not what's important. The important thing is that you have a naming convention. And I believe the most important thing about that is that you understand it and that it clicks with you, and that naming convention is something that you can follow the logic and you can adhere to. Because if you have one that's kind of forced on you and you don't understand it, then it's really not going to do you a lot of good. So this is an example of a naming convention. And this is an example of my naming convention and something that I have come up with for myself that works really well. What is important is that you document. Now, don't worry about this. You don't have to screenshot. You can screenshot it, but I am including a PDF version of this session so that you can have this. But this is a starting point. This shouldn't be the end all be all, but perhaps this one clicks with you or you make your own, doesn't matter. Whatever it is, a naming key. This is a naming key that I start all flows. I refer back to my naming key to make sure things are consistent. So here is a flow. that is from a Trailhead project. And so I had no choice in the naming convention here. And I'm using this as a perfect example of how you're going to come up with your own naming convention, or you're going to try out mine, or you're going to try out another one that you've seen. Is that when you do these projects, Salesforce has you name things a certain way to get your badge. And here it is, new contact. So there's nothing wrong with that in a Trailhead project. Salesforce cannot teach you 10 concepts at one time. This trail was about learning flow. It wasn't about naming. So there are some things here, that just in the real world won't work quite as well as they work here in such a small, simple flow. And if you only have 2 or 3 flows like this in your org, then maybe, possibly, okay, then this might be enough. But probably not. So this flow, new contact, it's not specific enough for me, okay? New contact info is a screen property. You're going to see that I name screens a little differently. That contact name, this one's a killer. The API name that Salesforce has is account. Okay, so in a real world, you don't want an API name that just says account in your flow. What type of account? What is it? A current account? Is it an updated account? Is it a new account? Is it a vendor account? Is it a client account? And what is that? Is that pick list field? That's a pick list field that has an API name of account. So these kind of things can get you in a bit of trouble once you are in the real world. So I suggest, if you have these in anything that you've done for Trailhead, that you use this as learning to come up with a real naming convention that works for you, and that is a starting point, because these type of things in your developer org are not in production, and you will have no problems with the renaming. So this flow is a little closer to real world, but this isn't even real world. This is in my developer org. I did this flow for a session at Dreamforce, and it wasn't even a flow session. It was a Lightning component session that I needed a flow running for. So I built this really, for myself, not to be seen, really. And this was a couple of years ago. So even this, I do have my variables. Those, I don't mind the way I name those, but some of this stuff is making me cringe right now. But this is the idea, is that this complexity, when you get into the complexity, the naming really, really matters. So how are we going to go about learning how to name things, and what do we do? So I'm in a developer org. You see how many flows I have here? Some of these were installed as a package. I think Salesforce still on the App Exchange has something called sample flows or something. So if you want stuff to work with, you can grab that, or you can create new flows or what have you. But I have a lot of flows in my developer orgs because I use it for experimentation. And here's one from 3 years ago. Okay, so my naming convention was a little different back then. Again, this is my developer org, not my production org. And I just want to show you how you go about refactoring a flow. Okay, so here I'm doing it, saving it as a new flow. And you can do this just as you're experimenting. I have a exclamation point. That means in my flow, I know that means I'm doing a DML in that flow. 140. I have a numbering system. Every single flow or automation in my system has a unique number. Account. That is where I'm going to run my flow from. I'm going to run from the account page. S for system. SF, screen flow. What is my DML? Create contacts. Now I may have more DMLs than that, but I just put at least one there. And then in the description, I would use that here if I had a lot of complexity going on and I wanted to be very clear about what this flow is doing. So now I'm doing a refactoring to some degree here, and I have a new flow. And now I can choose user context. That wasn't always a choice. So I'm going to switch to system context. And I have keeping it as a screen flow. I could do an auto launched if I wanted to, and then make some changes to this flow. And here's API version. Now, every time Salesforce does a release, they change the API version. And I'm going to upgrade this to a 52, the newest version of API. We were on 49 when I built this flow. Be very, very cautious. Now I'm in developer org, it doesn't matter. And this is where you should do this. You want to test, 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 because as each API version changes, Salesforce is doing different things and handling flows slightly differently. You can find that in release notes for each release. So that is what we would want to do here as we are in a dev org, and this is exactly what I want you to do. Learn best practices this way. Okay. Back when I built this, however many years ago, I do things slightly differently. And it's, again, a best practice that I have learned over time after having to debug so many flows. I always define my record ID. So if my user is sitting on the account page and there's Salesforce automatically pulls in record ID, I want to define it and change it from record ID so that that value is now on whatever account, like this, current account ID. So what I'm trying to do here, underscore assign, that's my naming convention. I always underscore what the element name is. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is have a variable that's going to be var, that's my naming convention, not just account, current account. So my naming convention is if my user's sitting on a record and I want to pull that in my mind, that's current account. That's different than an updated account. That's different than a new account that I might be creating later in my flow. I am defining that very, very clearly. This is best practice to know exactly what your variables are representing. Default value. Now, this is another choice. I use my globals. I use my global empty string. I use my global false. Null is different. If I leave this blank, this is null. So again, consistency. When I do a decision or something like that, it would matter whether I leave it as null or I do global. Very consistent. I always use my global constants. Okay, that's a choice. But again, that would be a best practice flow situation here. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying that record ID that Salesforce automatically is passing in, I want to pass that value to my current account ID. And I do that so that when I debug or when I glance at a flow, I know what my record ID is representing. There's no question what record ID is. It's my current account. So I can see it plain as day right at the beginning of the flow. So there is no question. I'm sure there are people that if you did forget to do this and you confuse record ID and you go and get it somewhere else, you can get into a lot of trouble. So that, again, you always want to click save. So we are just doing a little refactoring here just to talk about these things. So if you're new to Flow and you haven't really done it too much, you would create a variable exactly like that with lowercase r, a text variable in your flow for Salesforce to pass in that record for you. And that can also be used in Lightning components. So we have record ID, and so we've passed our record ID to our current account ID. Now here's a get. This is an old flow. You see how I named it account lookup. Well, we used to have to choose lookups and all these things. So my ID was equaling record ID when I built this many years ago, but now I want it to be my new variable. And again, this makes it clear as day as to what's happening. When I'm doing my get, I know what that get is for. It's current account, okay? I can glance at it and know what is happening there. So back when we did this flow, I used to have to assign my own variables. Now Salesforce can do that for us. So we're going to do that. But first, I'm going to rename with my naming convention. I'm going to rename my get. So I start with account and I underscore get. Okay. Again, I underscore all of my elements, and you'll see why that matters a little bit later. But I adding current account to my label and current account to my get. So that if I went and got it later after it was updated, I would say updated account get. So I know what I'm getting. Is it the one that where my user was first on the record, or is it later in the flow after the user has done something to the record? Okay, so right now I'm just going to let Salesforce go ahead. And again, I'm in a developer org. This flow doesn't mean anything. This was built for a session at some time. I can make all of these changes and learn as we go. So these naming conventions, so now I can spot if I were opening this flow, I know it's flow 140. I know I'm running on account. I know I passed in my account ID correctly from record ID, and now we're on a screen. You can see that I am consistent in my global empty strings there. And so API name is different, underscore screen, okay? API name is different than the label. The label says contact form, which is fine, but I want my API to say underscore screen. So there's very, very clear as to what it is now. I personally don't use previous and pause. I build it into my flow if I want that. Have caution with that because of the way that your users can go back and forth and change values, and it can be very complicated. Okay, so there's my global and my first name. Now I'm gonna underscore, and this is super important, input. Now, why didn't I just say first name text? Because Salesforce is already gonna show us the little text icon. Input, so that when I'm doing an assignment or when I'm doing an update or a create and I'm grabbing this field, it's clear as day that that was inputted from my user, okay? We don't want, I think it's frozen, possibly. Hold on one second. There we go. The input is super, super important on all of these things. So I don't care whether it's a currency, a date, an email, I do input, underscore input. And because when you are assigning this later, you're going to see the API name, but maybe phone number is actually a formula, and you wouldn't even know that you pulled formula instead of input from your user when you meant to pull input. So the way it works is that you should be very, very clear in your API name so that when you go to get resources, you're getting the right resource. And so with display text, I always underscore display text so that I know most likely I'm not going to use that anywhere else. And it's just, so if I had something with a similar name, I'm not going to take the wrong one. And that is really very, very important. The header, because of my naming convention, I very rarely show the header because flow 140 doesn't mean anything to my users. Okay, so here. So we're back to my naming convention. So we saw a little bit of how I do it. So you have a lot of choices to make here. Some people use prefixes instead of suffixes. I like the suffixes because when I'm scrolling down, I want to see what I want to see quickly. And I use, you see, I use exclamation points and dollar signs and ands, and I categorize what the flow is doing. So I have all of these choices are choices you need to make for yourself. But whatever it is, then you want to stick with it. You want to be consistent. So here is a debug, and I can glance at this in 10 seconds. I know it's flow 107, so I can go find that flow really, really fast. I know I'm in user mode. I know it's a screen flow. I know I'm running that flow on account. And I know my DML is updating the billing for that account. Clear as day because of my naming convention. Now, if I just had billing something else and just, a bunch of descriptive words, I may not have any idea where that flow is. I could have something with a similar name or what it's doing. I have a get to NDT flow switch underscore NDT. That's custom metadata. I have a subflow that I'm checking to see if it's global true. Let's see what else we have here. So these things, and that's a whole nother best practice, is to debug and to see your usage on all of your flows, is that you really, really need to understand from anywhere else, not inside of your flow that you say, oh, I can look at my elements anytime and click things open. You don't want to do that. If you name it right, you don't have to. So it leads to the next thing, subflows. So Salesforce is saying, this is back to the best practice document that we saw earlier, use subflows, which is great advice. Now, there are so many uses for subflows. You don't want to go overboard and have thousands of subflows, obviously. But in things like error emails, in things like error screen messages to users, these subflows, there are so many different use cases for subflows. And one of the best ones is if you have a user mode screen flow and you want to have your user do some operation they don't have privileges for. I have an automation log that goes behind the scenes on certain flows that are highly complex. And that automation log, the user doesn't need to even know that exists. But for them to write to that object, I give them that privilege in a subflow. Just an example. So here in one of my developer orgs, we can look, I've created a view of all of my subflows. So because my naming convention is so consistent with and, I'm able to create a list view and see my subflows. And one of the things I will say is when you use subflows, you need to be deliberate in that flow is meant to be a subflow. If you just decide I'm on account now, oh, I think I wrote some flow about contacts somewhere, maybe I'll just throw that in here and use it as a subflow. No. And I was just showing there that because I use and, how easy it is for me to create a list view of subflows. So I can see on my flows, which flows are flows, subflows, which flows are templates, etc. So I have this deliberate naming convention. Again, back to my naming key. Everything kind of circles back in how it can be used. And so I use an and I also number all of my subflows in addition to my flows. And you'll see why that numbering system, aside from being able to find it on a list, is so important, because I can leverage that number and use it in so many ways you wouldn't imagine. But a great use for a subflow is to run a subflow as an auto launch flow. And that way it's running in system mode and you don't have to worry about your running user at that moment with whatever you need to do in that sub process. So here we just talked about user and system mode a little bit. Now, if this is a concept you don't really understand, I would say this is something you really need to dig deep. And so Salesforce number 6 on best practices is mind the flow context. Okay, so an auto launch flow is always in system mode, which I just talked about using that as a subflow. And so this is in that document, and this is a concept that can be quite confusing at first. So I did a deep dive. I don't mean to keep plugging my own sessions, but I only know the content of my own sessions on Automation Hour. I think it was a year ago in July. If you go to that session, I demo all of the things of user context versus system context. And there is one gotcha I have to mention, is if you use a subflow and your user has access to the main flow, but they don't have access to the subflow. Let's say your subflow is only available to admins, but I'm running another user flow that I have access to. I've given them access to. It goes top down. In other words, you can give your users more permission than you probably might have wanted to if you grab the wrong subflow and are not aware of what context you're in. Because if someone has access to flow A and you run a subflow B, they will also have access to subflow B whether or not you've given them that access. So that's something that I talk about in depth in this other session. So let's create a subflow. Okay, so you see my naming convention here with the and. I know that all of those subflows are available to me to grab here. And the one with 101, I don't want to take that because that's not ready, because a subflow might have different inputs and outputs, and it has to be compatible with the flow that you're going to use it in. So here's a perfect example of a subflow that you would want to create is for fault email. And I have this, and I'm just grabbing the API name of my subflow, and then I underscore the word subflow. Again, this is how my naming convention is. I'm always using the element name. Now, it looks a little funny. I have some really good labels there, but that's just too long of a name for my label. So labels are meant to be very user-friendly so you can see them really quickly and know what's happening in your flow. Don't go too long or that you can't read them, you can't understand them. You'd always have to be clicking open to read everything that's there. It's the API name that should be long if necessary and have all of the information you need. The label should get to the point, right? And be very concise. Now, that's below 256. If I have an error message somewhere on a flow 256, I can find this really quickly. But most likely I'd be making my change on the subflow and not here. But you want to be able to find things very quickly. So another best practice is hard-coded logic. Okay, so Salesforce explains it as logic abstraction. Okay, does everybody understand what that means? That's why you get into a developer org to learn this stuff. Logic abstraction. So what they're trying to say here is that you should leverage custom metadata or custom labels or even hierarchical custom settings for certain situations in order to have your logic to simplify so you don't have so many decisions. Okay, so metadata is a brilliant way to make rules, if this, that, and to have tables of information. So let me show you what I've done here and the ones that I use, and I have many more in production. But in my developer org, I'm going to show you a couple of metadata examples. The first one was the fault email. We just saw the subflow. Okay? So what that does is instead of hard coding the fault email into a flow, I have a metadata record that I look up to and I do a get, because metadata doesn't cost you a SQL query. So I am saying here, if it's sandbox, I'm using one email, and if it's production, I'm using another email. Don't hard code IDs, okay? that is like a #1 best practice everywhere in Salesforce, and especially here. So in Flow, if we use custom metadata, we don't have to hard code IDs. There's other ways to do it. There's many things you can do, but this is one perfect example. So one of the things you wondered why I'm numbering things, aside from the ease of finding them, is so that with this number, I can look up to my flow switch, which is custom metadata, and make determinations and decide certain things about those flows that I want to make changes to without having to go into each flow and make changes. So validation bypass is one of the things I do with my flow switch, as well as an on and off switch. And you may say, well, you can deactivate a flow. Well, then you have to find the right version, and you have to deactivate and then reactivate and then save as, and all of these things. There may be an emergency where something is really going wrong and I need that thing off and I need to find it quick. So I have on and off switches. Also, I can turn it on for certain people and turn it off and do all kinds of things with the on-off switch. So that is an example of the metadata. And I think that everyone should use some version of this, even if it's just for the validation bypass. Okay, which is another best practice you're going to see in a moment. So this is a very simple custom metadata. And what you do is you go into custom metadata, you create a new one, and then you make fields. And the fields are just like any object, okay? And you can see I have automation number, flow name, flow type, switch, and validation bypass. I have just 5 fields on this one for simplicity. Okay, so automation number, I'm going to tell you, this is the key to everything. You don't want to try and match up names because you're going to have long names for your flows, even if you don't use my naming convention. So automation number. Now, that is the key to everything, because all I have to do is look up the automation number and have a match and then look for the setting that I'm looking for. The key is automation number. That field is a text field. Don't make a number field. Make a text field and make it unique. And I've made mine a length of 4 because I will never have that many flows in my God. That is not best practice to have that many flows, thousands of flows running in your org. So unique text field, that is the key to everything. So I don't want a flow 101 and another flow named 101 and another flow named 101, or a process builder named 101 and a flow named 101. Unique automation number. This custom metadata, by the way, can also be used for your process builders. Unique number. So how then do you use this? I have metadata, and I have you mentioned a validation switch, and you mentioned subflows, all these things. God, I have to build that every time I build a flow. What a nightmare. That's where templates come in. It's along the same line as a subflow. Again, best practice. So you would do a template, and you would do this one time. You would put everything you could ever want into a flow, and a certain type of flow. And then you would reuse it over and over when you're starting to build your flow. So this is my naming convention. I am also very clear on templates, just like I am with subflows. I don't just grab any old flow to use as a template, okay? It's deliberate that I know what that template is for. And this one is for a screen flow, okay? And I call this flow switch master. So again, because of my naming convention, I can create a view in my flows to find all of my templates. Now, Salesforce also has a checkbox for template. Now, this is really meant, I believe, for developers of packages. And you would just go into details and check it on or off if you want this to show and say, hey, I'm going to use that as a template. Your description should be all of the items that are included in that template. so that you know which template you want to use for particular flows. I will mention that checkbox in production, sometimes that checkbox doesn't work or doesn't show up, so that's why I use the $sign. So here is one of my templates. This flow will never be activated. It's not meant to be activated as it is. It's meant to be a template. So the way you would use this is I would just do save as new flow, okay? And then I would decide what I'm just going to put some name here just so we can move forward and give it a number. And I want that to be a number I haven't used before. So I would be looking at my custom metadata first and say, okay, I'm at 181, I can use 182. Doesn't even have to be in order, as long as they're unique. I'm going to put this in system context, this flow. I could choose user context. And if I really wanted to, I could make this an auto launch flow, even though it's a system mode. But I would have to take all of my screens out as soon as I click save. Salesforce will give you a little warning. And then once you delete your screens, you can proceed. I do recommend you do a deliberate screen, one for screen flows and a different template for auto launch flows. So here's a subflow that I have already ready for me here. Vault email, there it is. It's already ready to go. I don't have to do anything. So I don't have to go through that process on every flow to have my vault email. I also have some screens, and I like to use this GIF on screens, and then I put a real specific message to my users about whatever flow they're in. So I'm just going to add that later. That's why that's not a subflow. And here's another one that I know I want to do something like that in most of my flows, so I have that. So now that I'm in an actual flow that's going to be activated, I have to assign it an automation number. So I put that in my label, and then I assign the value. See? So now I've said my variable automation number is 182, which matches the name of the flow. So what's going to happen is we're going to go to the custom metadata in a get and look for that automation number. And then we're going to look for the settings. And that flow switch is underscore MDT. That's a metadata record, the one we just saw a moment ago. You see the naming convention, how consistent underscore get. So let's peek at that real quick again and look at our flow switch. So I don't have a 182 here. So right away I know I have a problem. So that flow will fail. So I would create my record, okay? And we're not going to do it all now, but I would create my record. The label name is 182, which matches the name I gave it. So my get gets the record and now says, did we find the record? Does it match the variable? And if it doesn't, if it's empty, like this is, if I forgot to do it, I would get an error, okay? Error underscore outcome. And if my switch was off, it would be off, and my default should be switch on. So that is how we would do this. You see the switch on and off. I've done it as a pick list. And you see my validation bypass is a checkbox, on, off. If it's on, then I'm going to bypass validation. Okay? I'm hoping that makes sense. So I have a subflow, and this is what I'm using as that error message is for me, because when I debug this flow the first time and I didn't assign the number, I'll get that message. And that'll be a one-time thing because your user, it should never happen because you will have debugged. Okay, so I also go that next step of assigning whether the switch was on and off, and assigning whether or not I'm running my validation bypass. Is it true? Is it false for this flow? And that's what I want to know. And I just want to be aware of that in my flow, and that's why I have a validation on as an assignment. And then the next thing I would do to move on the flow is to go through and start my flow here, record ID equals whatever variable. And I just have a temporary name in my template, doesn't matter. And now I'll create a new variable for whatever record I'm going to be passing in, wherever this flow that I created for my template is going to run. And so let's just say I was going to do this on current, let's just do contact. And so I would say that I'm going to assign current contact ID, and then I would have my variable, current contact ID variable equals record ID. So another best practice is fault paths. And you saw that I had that. I had a screen fault path. I had also the email fault path. So one thing that you would do in your template is set up at least the elements that you're going to need for those fault paths. And we just saw the validation very quickly, a way to bypass validation rules. And you want to be able to do that, especially in your auto launch flows. So you want to build that in. So you see here, this is one of my switch from production. It has more fields there. So I use the switch not just for on and off. I also use this for validation, bypass, and documentation. So on my list of flow 121, I would have notes, and I would know what my input or my output, if I was using it as a subflow, what version I'm running, and that type of thing. So when you use these numbering system, when you go to put your validation, your metadata into a validation rule or into a formula, you see how easy that is because Salesforce is looking for the flow label. If my flow label went on for days and had 10 words on it, it would be much harder to find the right one. But I have a numbering system, so I know that my custom metadata flow switch, I want 121 or whatever number it happens to be. So here it is with 121. What I'm doing in this validation rule is I'm saying on that flow switch, the metadata for that flow, is it true or false? So in other words, if it's false, if it's not checkboxed, this validation rule can run. But if that checkbox is true, this validation rule doesn't meet this criteria. And so this validation rule will not run. And that is how you would put these criteria added to your validation rules. But that does have some limitations because now you have to do that. I don't know how many. You may only have 2 flows that it really matters, that are running in auto launch mode, that it's really important, and then it's tremendous. But if you need to do also bulk updates and other things, you may find that you want to do it a different way. And so you can use custom metadata, just a different type of record that wouldn't reference each individual flow. You would do something like I've done with custom settings here that would just be an on-off global, and for I have account and I have contact. This I've done with custom settings, and if you use hierarchical custom settings, that's another way of solving for the same thing. Again, this is something you can really experiment with and figure out what works best for your use case and all the different ways. There's so many different ways to do this, but it is best practice. So in a custom setting situation, this would be more globally. If I use this for my validation, it's going to be off everywhere, or any rule that I add this to the rule. Any of those validation rules that have this criteria, when I turn it off, it's off whether someone's in a flow or whether someone is on a record page. And so that's the difference. If you want it just flow specific so that your user's still doing work in the UX, so it triggers the role, you would want to go the other way. And so you're going to use hierarchy custom settings. Or you could do a metadata in a very similar manner to this. Very simple. I like to have a global option because that global option is very good for, let's just see how we would do this, to be able to turn everything off at one time and not have to worry about which object that validation rule is sitting on. So just gonna name this really, really fast. We're almost out of time here. Bypass, and then underscore custom setting. Again, for debugging, you really, really want to do that because it'll just show up as bypass and you won't know what it is. Okay, so we do that, and this is the one thing I just want to mention, and this is how you create a field. So I would do a checkbox, and then I would just do global, let's say, and there we go, just like creating any other field. And so you have the idea there with the custom settings. There's just, you also perhaps want to do it for your different objects. So there's so many ways to do this. I can't tell you the absolute way because you are going to have your own situation. Okay, so with the hierarchical, there is just one more step, is to make the record for that. And then you have to choose whether you want that to work for one profile, one user, or org-wide. And that would be in the manage. You would click manage, and then the lower new is for profile or user, and you saw the other new button on top. That one will give you a global role. We're going to have to move on here. So this is the end of the admin Salesforce blog on best practices, where they give you this 10 thing kind of consult the checklist. And so this is why you really, really need to read that article and everything. And I wish we could handle everything as it was. We didn't get through everything. But get in your dev org and just start trying these different things out and learning all the parts of this that you may not already know. And I will say on documentation, because I don't have all the answers, but Michelle Hansen, who's on this call, did a tremendous session at Dreamforce, which you may want to look at, which is more detailed on documentation and documentation throughout your entire org and how important that is. And I will stay safe and be well. Hope to see you again soon. I hope we get some in-person events this year. And aloha.
Awesome. That was such a great presentation, Monica. Thank you. And we've got the questions rolling in. So I'm going to start with what we've got in chat.